Hello, United Scholars. I am Jennifer Lucero, and I am the United Scholars Worldview Specialist. And this month, we are going to be talking about the country of Guatemala. So let's take a look at our globe and find out where in the world Guatemala is. Now remember, a globe is simply a map of our world that is round, just like our planet. So Guatemala, let's come on over this way. Focus. Guatemala is right here in Central America, and you can see this arrow right here is pointing to where we live in Phoenix, Arizona in the United States of America, and Guatemala is not that far away. Look at that. Now Guatemala has more than 17 million people. That's a lot of people. Let's take a look. How many people that is. You can see right here in red, I have outlined the state of Arizona for you. And I have placed the country of Guatemala in blue so that we can see a size comparison. Now you will see that the population of Guatemala is 5.5 million people. Sorry, Arizona, that's our population. The population of Guatemala is way more than that. It's 17 million people. All of them concentrated in a small space, just like that. Now, the population of our country, by comparison, is 325 million people, and the population of the whole world is 7.5 billion people. Now, the country of Guatemala has a very young population, which means that there's a lot of families, and some of these families have a lot of kids. And so it is the fastest growing population in the Western Hemisphere. And the Western Hemisphere is, this is Canada, the United States, Central America, and South America. So all of this right here is the Western Hemisphere. So out of all of these countries in the Western Hemisphere, Guatemala has the biggest population. Can you believe that, in that tiny little bit of space? Now, what language do you suppose they speak in Guatemala? I bet I can help you out with that, because this is a map of Guatemala. And look at the countries that surround Guatemala here in green. We have Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The country of Guatemala speaks mostly Spanish because look, they've got Mexico right there. Okay, look at this. We've also got two oceans. We have got two bodies of water. We've got the Pacific Ocean down here and the Caribbean Sea up there. So that is your map of Guatemala. So they speak Spanish mostly, but really neat thing is that Guatemala has a history in the Mayan civilization, which we'll talk about in a minute, but they had their own language. And so people in the Mayan civilization, there were right now 21 different dialects, and that means different versions of the Mayan language. And so here's the good example. Let's say you lived in Buckeye and you spoke English in Buckeye, and you went over to Goodyear, which is right next door to us, and they spoke a different kind of English. And then you went to Avondale and they spoke a different kind of English. You went up to Surprise and they spoke a different kind of English, and you went up to Peoria. And if you all spoke a different kind of English, you would have a hard time understanding each other because you would use different words and different ways to communicate. And so that's what's going on in Guatemala, is that a lot of them will speak Spanish, but then so many of them, especially if they live in villages around the country, will speak a completely different kind of language and they can't understand each other. So you can imagine that creates a little bit of difficulty when trying to communicate back and forth. Now, the name Guatemala comes from the Mayan word for land of trees, and it's also called the land of eternal spring. And all of this is because where it's located is on the equator, near the equator. So you see this right here is the equator, this red line that runs around, and that separates our globe into the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. Now in real life, you cannot see this red line that goes around the planet. They do this on maps just to show us. But countries that are very close to the equator tend to be very warm, and they're often get a lot of rain and maybe have some tropical rainforests. And so Guatemala has quite a bit of that. They have rainforests, they have some dry land, they have coastal regions. So they kind of have the whole thing. And that's really great because that allows them to grow different kinds of things to sell. Remember, we call that exporting. When you sell something and sell it to another country, it's an export. And so they export a few things, and coffee is one of them, sugar, the white sugar that maybe you put on your cereal or sugar that's in a lot of our foods. They grow, they grow that and refine it, and they change it up a little bit so you get the white granular substance that you see. And bananas, they grow a lot of bananas there and export them. And well, what do they eat there too? They also eat a lot of bananas, black beans, tortillas, corn tortillas. Corn is another big crop that they grow there. So if you wanted to get to Guatemala, how would you get there? Because in the country we've talked about before, you have to go across an entire ocean, so you would have to fly there. But did you notice how close Guatemala is to us? Look at that. And there's land between us and Guatemala. Did you know that you could drive to Guatemala? That's right. You could get in your car and drive right on down to Guatemala. Most people fly because it's a long drive, but you could drive. In fact, this was so interesting. I didn't know this myself until researching for this presentation. There is something called the Pan-American Highway. This is a highway that runs from the very bottom of South America. This is in Argentina. It starts here and it goes all the way up. You see this red line? Goes all the way up through 14 countries to the very top of Alaska right there. And so it goes up along California, and you can see here's Phoenix right here, and here is Guatemala. So if you were to take this roadway from Phoenix to Guatemala, you could do it. You really could. But how long would it take if you wanted to go up this entire Pan-American Highway? Well, look at this. It's 30,000 miles long. Wow. And it would take you about 100 days. Probably more, because you want to stop off along the way and look at places like Guatemala, right? But isn't that cool that you could take a roadway that goes right up the entire Western Hemisphere? Isn't that fabulous? So Guatemala is in what we call a geologically active region, which means it has a lot of earthquakes and volcanoes. And I want to show you why. Do you guys remember in the movie Finding Nemo, when Nemo was in the fish tank with all the fish and he had to prove himself and they made him go swimming through the ring of fire? Remember that part? Well, did you know that our planet really does have a ring of fire? It's not just something in Finding Nemo. Well, let's take a look. This is a map of the ring of fire. So it has, and all of this is this red line that goes all the way around here. It has more than 450 active volcanoes, and it goes for 25,000 miles. It's from the southern tip of South America, right where that highway starts, and it goes all the way around the world and down here to New Zealand. So what this means for Guatemala is that they have over 30 volcanoes. Guatemala's right here, and 3 of them are still active. And the last time there was an eruption was June of 2017, and it was a volcano called Volcán de Fuego. But they also had a huge earthquake in 1976, and it left nearly 23,000 people dead, and 70,000 people got injured, and 1 million people lost their homes. And that's because in a country like Guatemala, their homes aren't very well made because they don't have a lot of money to make really well-built, strong homes. So when you have something that comes through like an earthquake, it can be really, really devastating and hard for that entire country. Plus, when you've got volcanoes exploding, so it can be a hard country to live in. Now, as far as the Guatemalan history goes, there are 3 very specific periods that they have in their history. The first is the Mayan indigenous period. The Mayans was an ancient civilization that was very advanced. Now, these days we have computers and cars and all of these electronic things and phones. We have all of these things. They didn't have that, but compared to all the other civilizations in the world at that time, they had things like they understood astronomy and looking at the stars, and they developed our map of 365 days. They were big into mathematics and came up with the concept of zero. Zero, what is that? So when you count your numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they all start actually before 1 with the number 0, and 0 means nothing. And before the Mayan civilization came along, people didn't even think about nothing, but they added the number 0 to the number line, which is really good because we need the concept of 0. But why is the Mayan civilization gone? Well, nobody really knows, but there was some overpopulation issues, and sometimes when you have just way too many people in an area and there's not enough food and there's not enough water, then a population stops thriving. There was probably some tribal fighting among the various tribes in the Mayan civilization. So they came to an end, but what they left behind were some really beautiful buildings because they had some amazing structures that they were able to build back in those days. And in the comments, I'm going to post a few. But the Mayan civilization is an entire topic all to itself. And so maybe your parents could talk to you about that and do some research. It's pretty amazing stuff, guys. But one of the great things that they did was they had a written language that they used for communication, and most civilizations back there didn't have that. So like we have our ABCs, which forms letters and words and sentences and paragraphs, which makes books and all sorts of interesting things so that we can learn. What they had was Mayan hieroglyphics. You see these right here? So let me get a little bit closer for you guys. So these are pictures that depict words. And look at all of these. Isn't that so neat? And this is just a few of them. But the neat thing is that over the years, people have been able to study these hieroglyphics, and they have been able to figure out what each one of these meant. And so they're able to look at a wall of hieroglyphics, like say on a rock, where they would carve them into. Now we're able to understand what they were saying to each other, which I think is so neat. So then after the Mayan civilization ended, and that went from about 300 AD to 900 AD, and right now we're in the year 2017. See, if you can do some math, you can see that was a long time ago, a long, long time ago. But then the Spaniards came after that and conquered Guatemala. Where is Spain? Let's hop on over here. So here we are, here's Phoenix, here's Guatemala. If you come over this way, and this is Europe. And it's hard for me to see. Wrong way. Hang on, guys. I'm backwards when I show this to you. Okay. So Spain is over here. Okay. So what they had to do in Spain is they had to get on their boats, their big boats and ships, and come all the way over here, which took a long time. So they traveled down this way and they come to the country of Guatemala. And what they do is they conquer it. That means they took it over. And their rule in Guatemala lasted from the 1500s to the 1800s. And when that happens, you have two different cultures, very different cultures who combine. And so that is why they speak Spanish in Guatemala now. And in addition to the 21 existing Mayan dialects. So all those languages we talked about where it's a little bit different and they can't really understand each other. But the Spanish also brought over citrus fruits, such as lemons and oranges. Those are citrus fruits. They brought over olive oil and garlic. So when the Spanish came over, they did bring some things to contribute to the Guatemalan society. And that makes a whole different kind of culture. And so Guatemala is no longer conquered by the Spaniards. And so in this day and age, it's known as the modern republic era. So let's talk about the population of Guatemala. So almost half of Guatemala's population is under the age of 19. That means they're teenagers and they're children. Isn't that amazing? The average age in Guatemala is the age of 22, and that is still really, really young. And so that means that you have got a lot of people with young families. And so they're the most populated country in the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is really interesting. I didn't know this either, but at the age of 18, people in Guatemala can vote just like here in the United States. In the United States, everyone is allowed to vote, but in Guatemala, there are two groups that are not allowed to vote, and it is those who are in the military, and police officers are not allowed to vote. And in fact, on voting day, people who are in the military have to stay in their barracks, which is their home where they all live together, and they're not allowed out because the government doesn't want them to go out and be able to vote. So that's just something that's interesting and very different from our country, because here all of us can vote once we're 18. So let's talk about some of the social issues in Guatemala. So Guatemala, you saw how populated it is, and they have the highest rate of poverty in Latin America. Latin America is, again, here's us in Arizona, here's Guatemala. Latin America is basically all of this down here into South America. There's quite a few countries in there, but Guatemala is the poorest of all of those countries. 60% of the population in Guatemala lives on $2 a day, and 30% of the population lives on less than $1 a day. Think about it. $1 here really doesn't buy us much, does it? You could go to the dollar store and get a few things, that's for sure. But $1 here doesn't get you very much. And $1 in Guatemala, if that's all you make in a whole day, can you imagine trying to feed your kids and pay your bills and pay the rent on your house and just get around? It's very, very hard. And that means that Guatemalans have a hard time getting their kids to school because they have to pay to send them to school a lot of times, or school's just not available. Now remember, we are talking about a kind of country that doesn't have very much money, and so there's not a lot of electricity. They don't have computers and phones a lot of the time. They don't have books for their schools or papers or pencils. They don't have the things that we have here in our schools or in your homeschool setting. The average Guatemalan kid goes to school for about 5.5 years. That's it. So maybe that's 1st through 5th grade or kindergarten through 4th grade. It's not very long. And you do learn some things when you're in elementary school, sure, but there's a whole lot more learning that can happen and that should happen, but they just can't. And so what happens is in these countries, when the kids can't get an education that goes on for a long time, like say here in the United States, where you get at least 12 years of education, well, then you can't get very good paying jobs in Guatemala. So it's a hard life. And a lot of times if the kids don't go to school, they have to work. Even at a young age, they have to work. Also, reading is a big issue in a country like this. Now in Guatemala, 70% of the women do not read. And so that means if they can't read, they can't teach their kids to read. And if their kids aren't going to school and learning to read there, and many of them are not, then the kids grow up not being able to read. And isn't that sad? It's so important to be able to read, and some of them just cannot. And the other thing is that nearly half of kids in Guatemala under the age of 5 are chronically malnourished. And this is the highest rate of malnourishment in the entire world. Now, we talked about this before, and malnourished means you don't have enough food, good food, and clean drinking water to keep your body healthy. And if you don't have that, your body can get very sick. And so a lot of those kids are sick because they just don't get enough good food. So we're once again looking at a country that's known as a third world country, where it's a very poor country. People are not able to work good jobs and make good enough money. But I love this part of my presentation because this is where I can tell you about hope. Because I work with a country called Trades of Hope. And what we do is go into countries, we're in 16 countries around the world, and we form groups of people, and they're mostly women, but these people make things that we ship over to the United States to sell for them. And Guatemala is one of my favorite countries because they make some of the most beautiful, colorful items. This right here is what's called a turtle backpack made in Guatemala. And look at all of these fabrics. They're all kind of different fabrics that are sewn together. Isn't that neat? And these are traditional fabrics made in Guatemala. Super cute and colorful and fun. So there are some moms that get together and make this for us to sell in the United States. So they can make some more money to sell, get food and to send their kids to school and to be able to pay for their houses. Isn't that wonderful? Another thing that they make here, this is called the mosaic clutch. And look at that fabric. Look at these bright colors and purple and blue. You got some red in here and some black. Somebody makes this fabric. They weave all of this fabric together. Isn't that pretty? And here's another purple one. This is my favorite. Look at that. So this is made from a fabric that the women in Guatemala use to make shirts with. They're called blouses. And so you'll find this fabric on a lot of the clothing around the country of Guatemala. And Guatemala is very colorful. I'm going to show you in the comments some buildings in Guatemala, and they're just painted so vibrant and bright. So everybody, that is the country of Guatemala. I hope you've learned a lot. There's always more to look at when you look at these countries, and I encourage you to go to the library and check out what's called an atlas. And it's a book that shows all of these countries. I'm going to show you the atlas I used for this presentation today. I had to tape it back a little bit so that you all could see the map. But this is the atlas I used for Guatemala today to teach you a little bit about it. But there's a lot of countries and a lot of really, really great information in an atlas. That's upside down, isn't it? But just really great information on the countries, and you can learn about the weather that they have and volcanoes, and everything we talked about is in here for a lot of the countries in the world. Really, really interesting. So I encourage you to go to your local library and see what you can find. So I've loved doing this presentation for you guys because I love learning about these countries right along with you. And who knows what country we'll talk about next. I'm thinking about it already. Everybody have a great day and a wonderful, wonderful Christmas. Bye.